Not too many years ago, before the advent of the recovery room, the expression the operation was a success, but the patient died was common, and unfortunately true. A similar saying in aviation could be, the flight was conducted by the book, but the aircraft crashed anyway. These statements may sound familiar if you've been actively flying a few years, for similar words were in the September '77 Aviation Digest, in an article entitled, How to Crash by the Book. A reprint of the article appeared a year later in Flight Facts, entitled OH-58 Tail Rotor Stall, and in the November '78 Aviation Digest under the same title. In review, an OH-58 was on a mission to observe ground activity. 3 passengers were on board, and once at the field site, the aircraft was flown in a right-hand racetrack pattern. According to the pilot, his altitude varied in the pattern from 150 to 250 feet, and his airspeed from 40 to 70 knots. While in a turn to the south, with a quartering right tailwind, the aircraft refused to respond when the pilot attempted to roll out on his desired heading. An uncontrolled spin in the right built up, with all efforts to regain aircraft control in vain. To quote the pilot, the rotation was completely uncontrollable and gave the feeling the aircraft would come apart. He then split the needles and entered auto rotation. Here we see the aircraft's final resting position. At the time of this mishap, the cause was suspected to be a tail rotor stall. Now, however, with data from similar mishaps, it is generally accepted that they result not from true tail rotor stalls, but simply from insufficient tail rotor thrust to maintain directional control. Stated another way, the aircraft experienced a loss of tail rotor effectiveness. Since considerable attention has been focused on OH-58 tail rotor mishaps in aviation publications this past year, there may be a couple of questions in your mind. First, is the 58 the only aircraft subject to this type of mishap? And secondly, what are the chances of you personally becoming involved in a mishap of this nature? To answer the first question, theoretically, any helicopter with a single main rotor and a tail rotor to counteract torque and provide directional control could experience a loss of tail rotor effectiveness under certain conditions. The second question, what are your chances of being involved in this type of mishap, can best be answered by yourself. Your ability to answer it should be considerably improved after reviewing this presentation, analyzing your past flying techniques and habits, and then applying our discussion to your future flights. Since much of our discussion will be addressing common flight maneuvers and the performance planning process, you will benefit from it regardless of the aircraft you fly. This is especially true if you fly the OH-6 or the 58, for they are very similar characteristically and from an operational point of view. Studies are presently being conducted on the aerodynamics influencing tail rotor effectiveness, and we will not address that aspect. Instead, we will look at the common flight conditions involved with such mishaps, the flight maneuvers involved, proper pre-flight performance planning, and the flight techniques to follow to avoid a loss of tail rotor effectiveness. Last, we'll discuss corrective action to take should you experience such a loss. For a moment, let's review the flight conditions. First, flight altitudes were low, usually less than 200 feet AGL. Secondly, low indicated airspeeds existed, usually from 0 knots at a hover to around effective translational lift. Third, power being demanded was near the maximum torque available. Additionally, in many cases, collective was being increased when control was lost. The combinations of high power settings and the increasing of collective demanded that left pedal input be at or close to the maximum possible. 2 of the 5 tail rotor effectiveness mishaps of physical year 80 probably resulted directly from these factors when high power demands were made by the pilots, causing insufficient left pedal to be available to counter the resulting torque. Next, varying combinations of gross weights and density altitudes have been involved with recent mishaps. In the 5 cases of physical year 80, each aircraft was within design gross weight limits, and density altitudes were between 1,900 and 3,000 feet, except in one case in which it was over 6,600 feet. Finally, and this is of critical importance, either a tail or a crosswind existed at the point of loss of effectiveness. Now that we've reviewed the flight conditions involved with previous mishaps, let's look at the flight maneuvers being flown. As each maneuver is discussed, relate in your mind the conditions just covered. Some of the mishaps, as described at the beginning of this presentation, have involved observation missions in which right-handed circular or racetrack patterns were being flown. If a pilot isn't careful, he can seriously misjudge his airspeed while observing ground activity if he relies upon his apparent ground speed. To give an example, if 15 knots of wind is present and you depend upon apparent ground speed during the downwind portion of the pattern, your actual airspeed will be 15 knots less than it appears to be. This fact really should not become a consideration unless NOE or terrain flight is being conducted. For during normal cruise flight, your airspeed should not be allowed to decrease below the minimum autorotative rate of descent speed for your aircraft. A guard mishap in 1979 involved two of the maneuvers associated with loss of tail rotor effectiveness mishaps. First, a max performance takeoff and a right downwind turn at low airspeed. The turn to downwind becomes even more critical when approaching the point of translational lift, where more power may be required to prevent a loss of altitude. Another situation involved with previous mishaps has been during steep approaches, primarily when power was being increased to terminate them. It is especially critical when approaching a pinnacle or a confined area, where wind currents are subject to changing intensities and directions. If power and left pedal requirements are close to the maximum available, the approach should be terminated to the ground if possible and not to a hover. The fifth maneuver involved has been when a pilot decided to abort an approach and started a go-around after airspeed had decreased below effective translational lift. As power was applied and the aircraft nosed over to accelerate, a spin to the right began. In such a situation, the pilot becomes involved in an out-of-ground effect hover, requiring additional power and left pedal input. To avoid this, the decision to make a go-around should be made prior to losing effective translational lift or before descending below any barriers present. A last category, which encompasses a multitude of situations, is any zero or low airspeed maneuvering, such as during NOE flight or an out-of-ground effect hover. If power requirements or left pedal inputs are near max available, the left pedal turn should be made whenever tactical or operational conditions permit. You should also avoid steep cyclic turns, which would require additional power to maintain altitude or airspeed. Now that we've reviewed the maneuvers, we can see how the common flight conditions come into play. Each of them involves flight at low airspeeds and low altitudes, and close to maximum power may be required to perform them. Additionally, and very importantly, an increase in collective is made at some point to affect either airspeed or altitude, with an accompanying increase of left pedal. Lastly, with almost every mishap, either a cross or tailwind was present. You may now be wondering if you can safely fly at all without getting into trouble. The answer to that is an unqualified yes, as long as you properly plan your flights and then fly your plans. Anytime you are assigned a mission, certain performance planning should be made to ensure that sufficient power and tail rotor effectiveness are available to safely complete the mission. If you find that either insufficient power is available or that directional control is marginal, action must be taken to reduce the aircraft's weight, avoid flight under the conditions that would jeopardize safe flight, or else determine that the mission cannot be completed under the circumstances. A pilot is asking for trouble if he fails to consider the possible flight conditions of a mission and then completes thorough pre-flight planning. As an example, a pilot has an early morning mission involving only one passenger. At takeoff, the temperature is cool and winds are calm. The aircraft is within a large clear area and minimum power is required for the takeoff and climb out. 3 hours later, however, the temperature has increased 20 degrees, 15 knots of wind is present, and 3 passengers are on board for the final flight of the day. If thorough flight planning was not accomplished prior to the first flight of the mission, or now before takeoff with 3 passengers, the pilot is stacking the deck against himself. Thorough pre-flight planning, if for no other reason, would be required simply from a professionalism point of view. Operators' manuals, however, direct that planning be accomplished and that a performance planning card be filled out for use in completing the flight plan and for reference throughout the mission. Additionally, paragraph 4-1 of 95-1 states that pre-flight action will include an evaluation of performance data. Lastly, each new aircrew training manual contains a revised performance planning card and directs the completion of it. Thus, thorough pre-flight planning is required not only by professionalism, but by each operator's manual, by AR 95-1, and by the ATMs. For the next few minutes, we'll go through the planning sequence and complete the mandatory entries on the performance planning card for a takeoff. Although we will use the card from the observation helicopter ATM, its format is the same for all helicopters. The only differences are in the margin information. Our planning will be for an OH-58A mission, but similar performance charts are in each -10, and the planning process is basically the same for all aircraft. First, we'll fill out the top blocks on atmospheric and aircraft loading conditions. Our pressure altitude and free air temperature can be obtained from a weather briefing or from our aircraft's instruments. By dialing in 29.92 on our altimeter, our pressure altitude will be indicated, and our FAT gauge would, of course, provide our temperature. We'll use 2,000 feet and 15 degrees. From our 365F form and our known mission loading, we figure our gross weight at 2,600 pounds. The calibration factor block doesn't apply to the 58, and we plan for 450 pounds of fuel after run-up. Going on down the card, our mandatory blocks include our maximum torque available, our torque available for continuous operations, our predicted hover torque, and if we have sufficient tail rotor effectiveness with the winds expected during our mission. These are the only mandatory blocks for normal flight operations. For NOE flight, or for other flight operations requiring an OGE hover capability, we would also determine our torque required to hover out of ground effect and our maximum allowable gross weight. As shown in the margin of the card, we use figure 7-3 to determine our first entry, max torque available. We'll be using sheet 1 of 4, engine de-ice and heater off, but be sure to use a chart applicable to your aircraft's configuration. Also realize that the charts we'll be using apply only to the A-Series OH-58. The similar charts are found in other aircraft -10s. The planning process is also basically the same for other aircraft. We enter pressure altitude at 2,000 feet and move right to the 15-degree point. Coming down the chart, we find 80 psi to be our calibrated torque, which is also our indicated torque. Since 80 is in the yellow area, we can operate no more than 5 minutes at that power setting because of a transmission limitation. Our max torque available for 30 minutes becomes 79, due to a restriction of operating in the yellow arc of the TOT gauge for a maximum of 30 minutes. We would enter 80 and 79 psi on our performance planning card as indicated here. Next on the card is max torque available for continuous operations. We go to figure 7-4, and we'll again use sheet 1 for engine de-ice and heater off. Again entering at 2,000 feet pressure altitude, we move right to 15 degrees. Coming down the chart, we find 66.5 psi to be our maximum torque available. Since this is our maximum torque available for continuous operations, we would not round up, but would round down to 66 psi. Enter 66 on the card. Now that we have our 3 maximum torque available figures, just what do they represent, and how important is it that we don't exceed them? Well, they are all based on TOT restrictions, along with a transmission limitation on our 5-minute value. If you exceed 80 psi, you can also expect to exceed the TOT yellow arc limit of 749 degrees. If you exceed 79 psi, but do not go over 80, you can expect to remain in the yellow arc of the gauge, but will be limited by the transmission restriction of 5-minute operations between 79 and 92 psi of torque. Lastly, if you exceed 66 psi during continuous operations, you can also expect to exceed the maximum normal operating TOT of 693 degrees. The next mandatory entry on the card is our predicted hover torque, and figure 7-5, sheet 2 of 2 is used to determine this. As with the previous charts, we enter at 2,000 feet pressure altitude, move right to 15 degrees, and then draw a reference line vertically down the chart. Next, a line is drawn horizontally from the intersection of our vertical reference line and the 2,600-pound gross weight curve to the 4-foot skid height line. Again, coming down the chart, our predicted 4-foot hover torque is found to be 54 psi. We now have all of the mandatory power entries for the departure portion of our planning card if NOE flight is not a consideration. But let's also determine our hover out-of-ground effect torque and our max allowable gross weight for an NOE mission. OGE hover torque is found simply by extending our 2,600-pound gross weight line over to the 50-foot skid height line and coming down as we did for our 4-foot hover. We find 62 pounds of torque required to hover out of ground effect. Entering 62 on our card, we see that it is less than the 3 previously determined torque values, and we can expect to hover OGE at our gross weight of 2,600 pounds. We now know that from a power point of view, we can safely fly with our 1 passenger. But what if 3 passengers show up for the mission, or if we're at max gross weight? To answer this, we'll determine from the chart our maximum allowable gross weight. There are actually 2 ways of determining this. In the first method, we enter the chart at our max torque available of 79 psi. We move up to the 50-foot OGE line and then right to intercept the reference line. This intercept point may be referred to as our performance limit, and since it is above the 3,000-pound curve, we can expect to hover out of ground effect with 3 passengers or at max gross weight with our expected takeoff conditions. A second method is to draw a line from the 3,000-pound curve over to the 50-foot OGE line and then down to read 74 psi. Since this is less than our 30-minute torque limit of 79, we can again expect to hover OGE at max gross weight. Enter the figure 3,000 on your planning card. We have just recorded torque values for our first takeoff conditions of 2,000 feet and 15 degrees, and new computations would have to be completed for later flights if the variables have changed significantly. TC1-10 indicates that new values should be determined if temperature changes by 5 degrees or if pressure altitude changes by 500 feet. If you wanted to examine torque values for later in your mission, now, before your first takeoff, you could go through the planning process using expected maximum pressure altitude and temperature figures. That method would not be as exacting as when you use known figures, but would give you an idea of your aircraft's capabilities for later flights. Only 1 mandatory entry in our departure block now remains to be completed, and it is whether or not a safe pedal margin will exist under our planned flight conditions. Stated another way, will tail rotor authority with a 10% margin of safety remaining be available? Change 5 to the -10 contained a directional control margin chart, figure 5-6, which allows us to determine this. We first go to sheet 1 of 2. Entering the chart at 2,000 feet pressure altitude, we move right to 15 degrees. We then come down the chart and find that at neither 2,600 pounds nor at max gross weight are we within the yellow or restricted area of the chart. This indicates that we should have a sufficient directional control margin to safely hover with the aircraft's wind limitations of 35 knots crosswind and 30 knots tailwind present. But let's look at another example. If operations were expected at 8,000 feet and 0 degrees, we find that at max gross weight we would be within Area C, which has a max wind value of 20 knots. At 2,600 pounds, we would be right at the edge of the yellow area of 35 knots. We then go to sheet 2 and examine zone C. As stated in the -10, the left vertical line for each zone represents 10% control margin, and as you move towards the right vertical line, the margin decreases and reaches 0 at some point. With a 9-degree right crosswind, for example, a maximum of 10 knots could exist to ensure us a 10% margin remaining, and any greater wind would cause our margin to be reduced below 10%. It is very important to realize that this chart represents maximum winds under optimal conditions with the engine at 103% power RPM, and that any reduction of the engine power RPM below 103% will cause a reduction of the tail rotor thrust. Additionally, you should always hover into the wind whenever possible, of course, and if hovering turns are required, they should be made with smooth and deliberate tail rotor pedal inputs. The yellow area now being shaded identifies the conditions under which less than a 10% longitudinal control margin may also exist. 20-knot winds at 180 degrees, or 23-knot winds at the 210 and 150 degree boundaries would put you in the less than 10% longitudinal control area. Winds of 30 knots or greater could cause you to lose control of the aircraft. Although the 58-10 doesn't explain this, as far as the aircraft is concerned, relative wind can be equated to airspeed of the aircraft. 20-knot winds at 90 degrees, for example, could be equated to sideward hovering at 20 knots. Having stated this, you must realize that the directional control margin chart applies only to winds or flight of a given direction. It does not apply to turning flight, such as during NOE turns, which changes the characteristics of the tail rotor. After marking yes for safe pedal margin on our performance card, mandatory departure information is complete. We've spent considerable time on the performance planning card and on the -10 charts, but the importance of thorough pre-flight planning cannot be overemphasized. Once you're accustomed to going through the process, it doesn't take long at all. The information required for the arrival planning block is determined exactly the same way, using the same charts, so we won't go through that portion of the sequence. Don't forget, however, to utilize aircraft and weather information that is current each time you revise or complete the card. Now let's examine our actions at the aircraft. We know from our planning that with an expected gross weight of 2,600 pounds, a pressure altitude of 2,000 feet, and an FAT of 15 degrees, we should hover at 4 feet with approximately 54 pounds of torque. Small variances can be expected, however, and are acceptable due to small errors in the aircraft's gauges, slight reductions in engine condition and performance, and other factors such as wind variations and pilot control touch. But we want to basically verify with the aircraft what our planning charts indicate our power requirements should be. In accordance with Task 2002 of the ATM, we perform a 4-foot hover power check prior to our first takeoff, and each takeoff thereafter if gross weight, pressure altitude, the temperature, or winds have changed significantly. If our hover torque is at or below our predicted torque, our performance planning card is considered valid and no other checks are required. If, however, our torque is more than our predicted value, or if adverse winds exist, you must take one of 3 actions. You must either reduce your gross weight, re-verify the information on your performance planning card, or perform an out-of-ground effect hover check. Let's observe our pilot as he goes through the hover check procedures. He first verifies his pressure, altitude, and temperature planning figures with the aircraft's instruments and finds them to be correct. Since his passenger must be picked up at another site, he refers to the hover chart for his reduced gross weight of 2,400 pounds. He finds 49 psi to be required for a 4-foot hover and 57 for an OGE hover. He then stabilizes at 4 feet and finds his torque meter to indicate 51 psi. Since this is 2 psi higher than his predicted torque of 49, he sets the aircraft down and re-verifies his computations. Finding them to be correct, he decides to perform an OGE hover check. He ascends to 50 feet and makes a 360-degree left pedal turn. His actual torque is 59. Since the same variation of 2 psi is present as during his 4-foot hover check, he can expect his OGE torque with 1 passenger to be 64. Since that is less than his planned torque for continuous operations, he can expect, as his initial planning indicated, to perform out-of-the-ground effect maneuvers during his mission. Thus far, we've discussed the flight conditions and maneuvers involved with loss of tail rotor effectiveness mishaps, the performance planning card within TC 1-137, and have gone through a portion of the pre-flight planning sequence. We have also observed a pilot going through the hover checks required by the observation helicopter ATM. Although proper completion of the pre-flight planning process and performance of the hover checks can certainly reduce your chances of becoming involved in a loss of tail rotor effectiveness mishap, there are additional factors which can have a significant bearing on the tail rotor's effectiveness. The first involves aircraft maintenance. In a guard loss of tail rotor effectiveness mishap, tail rotor rigging was found to be incorrect, causing less than designed tail rotor thrust to be available with full left pedal applied. As a result, a one-time inspection of all OH-58s was directed, with numerous aircraft's rigging found to be improper. Considerable attention was given the problem in the maintenance system, and maintenance instructions are now very specific concerning the rigging process and the final checks to be made to verify correct rigging. The second factor involves you directly, the pilot of the aircraft. The terms pilot technique, pilot proficiency, control touch, and professionalism all could be used to describe what I'm speaking of. Remembering our previous discussion of maximum torques, I stated that the pilot could expect to hover OGE under the conditions. The charts usually reflect performance expected under no wind conditions, when the aircraft and its systems are operating at optimum levels, and when a pilot exercises proper flight techniques. If you're flying at 40 knots in OE at maximum gross weight and suddenly flare the aircraft to perform a quick stop with no regard for torque, TOT, or the existing winds, you're asking for trouble. If, however, proper flight techniques are followed, the aircraft's capabilities recognized, and appropriate attention given to the power instruments, you should be able to safely perform your mission. It's really a matter of getting back to the basics, flying like you did in the pattern in flight school. Your flying was precise then, and it should be now, even though you may have 10 years experience and over 3,000 hours. Having thoroughly completed pre-flight performance planning on the ground, there are several important considerations you must be constantly aware of in the air. The first is, what are the winds and where are they relative to my aircraft? Secondly, what are my aircraft's capabilities? And lastly, what are my capabilities? We have thoroughly discussed the first two considerations, but the last one is also extremely important, and one which requires professionalism to answer honestly. In your past experience, you probably remember a fellow pilot who could take off at max gross weight in a certain aircraft when no one else could, or who could easily hover out of revetment under certain wind conditions when other pilots would have difficulty. The important point here is that all of us have a certain level of proficiency and capability, and we must recognize that level and plan our flying accordingly. We have covered a lot of ground in this presentation, and now only a couple of points remain to be addressed. The first is, how do I recognize when I'm getting close to a loss of tail rotor effectiveness? We answered this question in part when we covered the flight conditions and maneuvers involved at the beginning of the presentation. But going a bit further, any time that your aircraft requires close to or max left pedal to maintain directional control, the possibility of a loss of effectiveness exists. The only additional factor required to cause a loss might be the reduction of your airspeed, the turning of the aircraft's tail into the wind, the demanding of additional power, or the inadvertent input of right pedal pressure. Even without the introduction of one of these factors, if the nose of the aircraft begins turning to the right and additional left pedal fails to stop the turn, a loss of effectiveness has occurred. The question now, of course, is, what action should you take to correct the situation? Should you indeed experience such a loss? As change 8 to the A model-10 indicates, there is no one pat answer, for your corrective action depends upon your height above the terrain and the altitude available at the time. If you should indeed experience a loss of effectiveness, you would reduce collective, as altitude permits, to decrease the torque effect of the main rotor, and simultaneously reduce your left pedal input. Then, as the aircraft turns into the wind, apply forward cyclic to accelerate through effective translational lift. At this same time, increase collective pitch and apply pedal as required for control and trim purposes. Now let's go through the steps once again and observe our actions in the cockpit. First, you would reduce collective, as altitude permits, to decrease the torque effect of the main rotor, and simultaneously reduce your left pedal input. Then, as the aircraft turns into the wind, apply forward cyclic to accelerate through effective translational lift. At this same time, increase collective pitch and apply pedal as required for control and trim purposes. If the spin cannot be corrected using these actions, then an auto rotation may be your only solution.
Hello, I'm George Lewis. Today I'm at the Space Museum in Huntsville, Alabama to bring you a message about disorientation. You know, when you maneuver a spacecraft or land on the moon, you do it by relying on your instruments. There's no other way. Of course, all the Apollo astronauts were airplane pilots to begin with, so the idea of flying on instruments was nothing new to them. Instrument flying wasn't always part of aviation. In the early days, flying through clouds was taking your life in your hands. The first cross-country airline passengers had to get off the airplane every evening and switch to a train. It took several days to make it from coast to coast. Today, we can fly safely day or night, good weather or bad, thanks to our flight instruments. We can, that is, as long as we trust the instruments. It's the first rule of instrument flying. It's all but engraved on the inside of your eyeballs by the time you get your instrument ticket. And yet every once in a while, somebody forgets. The UH-1 was flying in IMC. When they broke out, the pilot saw he was in a bank and immediately rolled level. But something was still wrong. The ground ahead was not the horizon, but the steep slope of a mountain. The pilot could have found this out with only a glance at his instruments. Result, 7 people seriously injured and an aircraft destroyed. The moral, believe your instruments. Here's another one. A UH-1 was returning to home base, flying under clouds that were continually lowering. When they got down to only 50 feet off the deck, the pilot radioed in for weather. Moments later, the radio channel echoed with the pilot's voice, "Hey, you're in a steep bank. Hey, 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 pull up, pull up, pull up." 8 people died in the crash. We'll never know why that pilot continued to try to maintain VFR when he should have been on instruments. Seat-of-the-pants flying was okay in the early days, and it still is, under the right circumstances. But it's no good at all when you don't have visual contact. I know you've heard that before. Let me prove it's true. Inside each ear, you have 3 semicircular canals on the order of this model. They're what give you a sense of balance. When you roll your aircraft into a turn, fluid in the canals starts moving, and a signal goes to the brain to say you are turning. Now, suppose you remain in the turn. After a few moments, the fluid settles down. The inner ear sends a message to the brain that you have stopped turning. Here we see a well-trained gymnast. Loss of balance and disorientation are her prime concerns when performing. Let me show you another way the inner ear can give you false messages. We're now starting you to spin. Tell us which way you're going and any changes as they occur.
Spinning to the right. Still going to the right. Still going to the right. Still going to the right. I've stopped. I'm spinning to the left. Still spinning to the left. Still spinning to the left. I've stopped.
The moral is, you cannot trust your senses. You've got to trust your flight instruments. The history of aviation is filled with tragic stories of pilots who didn't believe their instruments. April 1943, B-24s of the 376 Bomb Group depart from their base on the North African coast for a bombing raid on Naples. Problems plague the flight, and few bombs are dropped. For the return flight home, the formation breaks up. During the flight, the ADF needle swings, indicating the radio beacon at Benghazi. But it is much too soon to have reached Benghazi. The aircraft holds its course. No doubt you recognize the story. The aircraft was the Lady Be Good. After overflying her base, she continued another 450 miles into the desert. Why did it happen? Because they didn't believe their instruments. They didn't know about the unexpected tailwind that carried them to Benghazi much sooner than the flight plan said. When the ADF said Benghazi, they didn't believe it. That's why the Lady Be Good ended up in the Libyan desert, over 400 miles beyond her intended landing strip and lost for 17 years. Here are some pointers to keep in mind always. Remember that you cannot trust your senses. You must have a visual reference, either a natural one or an artificial one. When you're flying in broken conditions and you're in and out of the clouds, remember that going back and forth between gauges and visuals can lead to disorientation. Stay on the instruments and let the other pilot focus on what's outside. When you're on instruments, don't make any sudden movements. Turn to the side or reach down slowly to avoid the dizziness that used to be called vertigo. It can easily happen, especially when the aircraft is in a turn. And finally, remember to believe your instruments. This is Apollo 16, the actual spacecraft that flew to the moon and back. They couldn't have made it, of course, without believing the instruments. And the Lady Be Good could have made her destination if the crew had believed their instruments. Which will it be for you? If you want to come out like Lindy instead of like the lady, you'd better start forming the right habits now. Good luck and good flying.
For flight crews of turbojet aircraft taking off at or near maximum gross weight or in the final stages of landing, a sudden change in wind speed and/or direction in a short time or distance along the aircraft's flight path can be catastrophic. At the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, a program called the Joint Airport Weather Studies, and dubbed the JAWS Project, was established to investigate the magnitude of the wind shear threat in an aviation environment. Their early analysis led them to the conclusion that some types of wind shear, such as terrain-induced shears, nocturnal jet shears, sea breeze shears, and even the majority of warm and cold frontal shears were most often within the performance capabilities of aircraft, if anticipated by flight deck crews. So the JAWS research focused on those wind shears associated with convective storms, wind shears called microbursts, which seem to pose the greatest threat to aviation. A microburst is produced by the downdraft from a convective cell. As the vertical downflow nears the ground, it spreads out in all directions, causing a horizontal outflow and creating a situation where an aircraft attempting to penetrate the microburst would encounter the headwind, the downdraft, and the tailwind in a very short time and distance. At low altitude, on approach or departure, the resulting loss of airspeed can cause an accident. During the late spring and early summer of 1982, around Denver's Stapleton International Airport, the JAWS team brought together a collection of scientific equipment not previously used in this manner for wind shear research. Probably the most important of these tools was Doppler weather radar, which allowed the researchers to observe and record the directions and speeds of winds associated with convective storm cells moving through the area. Their findings were both impressive and surprising. Dr. John McCarthy, a pilot and meteorologist, was one of the directors of the project.
In our analysis of the JAWS results at Denver Airport, we found that there were many microbursts. It was very surprising to us, the number that we found. For example, we expected to see 10 to 20 microbursts in 90 days, and instead we saw 150. So there were many times more microbursts than we anticipated. We found some fascinating things. We found that microbursts can be incredibly intense, that the wind speed change when you fly through a microburst could be in excess of 100 knots in terms of wind speed. We know microbursts are very common here in Denver. We know from an experiment conducted in 1978 in the Chicago area that approximately half the number that occur at Denver occur at Chicago. That's still plenty of microbursts. We know from the accident statistics that microbursts occur anywhere where convection is occurring. We know that they occur in New York, St. Louis, Atlanta, Miami, New Orleans certainly, Tucson, and Salt Lake. We don't know all the places where they're occurring because we haven't set up all this fancy equipment. But when we have, or where planes have gotten into trouble, we have come to the conclusion that you can expect microbursts anywhere where there are convective cells, whether it's in the United States or anywhere in the world. One very interesting fact was that the average microburst during the JAWS project at Denver was 50 knots. And sad to say, that's stronger than the estimated value that brought down Pan Am 759 at New Orleans in the summer of 1982. So an average microburst is quite capable of destroying an airplane. In our careful look at our microburst statistics, we found that they don't last very long. They last 5 to 10 minutes. One of the most interesting things is that when a microburst first hits the ground, it's not as intense as it's going to be in the next 5 minutes. This is a very important finding because the first encounter, if it has just hit the ground, is half the intensity as it's going to be 5 minutes later. And several pilots have gotten into trouble by saying, hey, there's only a 20-knot shear, I can handle that, go into it and find out that it's a shear you can't fly through. Microbursts tend to occur in families. Not always, but oftentimes. We found that at Denver, that the presence of one microburst on some days was followed by the presence of many more microbursts, up to 15 on a given afternoon, often bunched into a 1 or 2 hour period. We conducted the JAWS project at Denver in 1982. In 1984, we were given the opportunity to test some of our concepts in short-term forecasting, detection, and warning of low-altitude wind shear back at Denver. For 45 days, we brought our research results to Denver in a real-time operational test to see if we could provide quantitative information to controllers and hence to pilots regarding the presence of wind shear. And we found that Doppler allowed us to come up with a 2 to 4 minute advanced warning of a microburst encounter by an airplane. And in fact, it was so successful that in one case we got a report back from a 737 pilot that said that the existence of that advisory saved his airplane from crashing. That's awful good news to people working in this kind of safety environment. My message to you as a pilot, and as to you as a controller, is to find ways of keeping aircraft out of microbursts. Avoid, avoid, avoid. That's the name of the game.
Awareness and avoidance of wind shear are important steps in being able to cope with it effectively. At many airports around the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration has installed low-level wind shear alert systems. At strategic points around the airport, remote anemometers measure wind speed and direction. They're usually located near the middle marker, but take into consideration terrain and other conditions unique to that airport. The peripheral wind information is continuously compared to readings of the center field anemometer, and if the differential exceeds a preset threshold, an alert appears in the tower cab. At 2 airports, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Denver, Colorado, the existing systems have been enhanced with additional detection stations to improve the system's ability to detect microburst wind shear. The low-level wind shear alert system is but one of the tools at your disposal. Remember, however, the absence of an alert does not preclude the presence of wind shear. If wind shear alerts are present, exercise extreme caution and look for other clues that may indicate the severity of the problem. For instance, we know that thunderstorms with heavy rain may include microburst wind shear. However, in some areas of the United States, you may encounter microbursts in much less severe conditions with little or no rain. These are called dry microbursts, and in these situations you may see precipitation trails or virga getting close to the ground but not actually hitting it. Below it you may see blowing dust. And if you have a situation like this, where you can actually see a ring of dust, it is a clear sign that there are extremely strong and localized winds. In other areas, you may see trees blowing out or flailing wildly, again a sign that extremely strong localized winds are present. Another source of wind shear information is pilot reports. Professional flight crews in particular are urged to make PIREPs. The recommended method for wind shear reporting is to state the loss or gain of airspeed, the altitude at which it occurred, your location, and type of aircraft. Since wind shear is such a dynamic phenomenon, PIREPs must both be made and disseminated as quickly as possible. There are also other potential clues as to the presence of wind shear. For instance, by examining the takeoff or landing path on your weather radar, although you cannot detect wind shear as such, you may see strong radar returns from thunderstorms which are sometimes associated with severe microbursts. Be aware, however, microburst wind shear can also occur in weak echoes, or in fact, with no radar returns. This is Captain Gary Gore, a 727 pilot for United Airlines with nearly 13,000 hours. In the late spring of 1984, he was involved in a very serious microburst wind shear encounter at Denver's Stapleton International Airport. This is how he remembers that day.
Well, that morning, as I was driving to the airport, I happened to notice the mountains to the west were starting to pick up some lenticular cloud formations. And later on in dispatch, as I was reviewing the weather forecast, they indeed had forecast virga to be forming in the area later on that afternoon. Also a possibility of wind shears in the Denver area. When I walked out to the aircraft, I noticed the area was developing quite a few virga clouds. And I checked with my engineer to see what the weather was as reported by the ATIS information. He said they reported gusty winds in the area predominantly out of the west, and they were using runway 35 left at Denver, which is over 10,000-foot runway. And we went ahead with a normal pushback, and as we taxied around the east end of the building, found about 18 aircraft in front of us waiting for departure. The ground control told us to stay with them and get in the line, and when it became our turn to move over to the run-up area, the south end of 35 left, that would be the time they'd switch us over to the departure tower frequency. I elected to use 5 degrees of flap for our takeoff and told them to plan for a normal leaper, and when we got out to the runway we would decide whether or not we would use the maximum leaper if conditions required it. There was fairly darkening lower level clouds coming in, and we could see some virga further up towards the north and the northwest of the airport. Nothing around the actual airport vicinity. We spotted some dust blowing about midfield point on the runway, and we discussed that in some length, and all recalled that they were doing some dirt moving and construction in that area, and that it indicated that there's fairly good wind blowing there, but nothing of any concern. About that time I heard a Rocky Mountain Dash 7 call to the tower that he'd had a 20-knot loss on climb out, and as I looked out the front of the cockpit window, I could see the Dash 7 was about the midfield point where we'd spotted the dirt blowing, and he looked to be about 200 to 300 feet above the ground. I then proceeded to brief the rest of my flight crew that due to the look at the sky conditions and that, we would still be using the 5-degree flap takeoff, that we would use maximum EPR for the takeoff, and then the tower cleared us to follow the next aircraft onto the runway. I turned on the color radar and observed and brought to the attention of the rest of the crew that we had a very strong cell with a red center approximately 35 miles northeast of the airport. But since everything was moving from west to east, that it would not be a factor, we'd be turning to the northwest away from it anyway. At that point, we were lined up on the runway, and tower cleared us for takeoff. Said your north field wind is 270. It figures about approximately 8 knots. Your midfield wind is 270 at 20, gusting to something like 28, which correlated with the wind that was blowing across the runway and all that dirt at midfield point. And your south field wind is 260 at approximately 9. So I told the rest of the crew, I said, well, that looks okay. Set takeoff thrust and move the throttles up to the max EPR setting for the takeoff power. So we continue with the normal takeoff, and about the point where we've been observing the blowing dirt and where we thought the 20 gust and the 30-knot wind was located, the co-pilot called out. He says, got an airspeed hesitation here at 120 knots. And I looked down, and as soon as I looked down, the airspeed was starting to, he says, oh, disregard it. He says, the airspeed's accelerating again. We continue with a normal takeoff roll and acceleration into VR. I started bringing the aircraft nose up, and I had about 9 to 10 degrees of body angle. When we just about reached V2, co-pilot called my attention again. He says, the airspeed's starting to decay. I glanced down to see the airspeed starting to move back towards VR. I reached over and I called for firewall power, and the co-pilot followed up on my push, and we had the throttles maximum forward. At that time, the flight engineer called out, you've lost 20 knots. I looked down and observed the airspeed had actually decreased 20 knots from our V2 speed, and we're now starting back. It was about 10 knots below what our VR speed had been. I checked the rotation at about the 9-degree point we had, and I realized that we were committed and had to try and get the airplane off the ground, and I continued with the rotation, noting that the V speed was still about, we're about 2 to 4 knots below VR speed, but continue with the rotation. At about the point when we had an 18-degree body angle or so, all of a sudden the airspeed shot up at the same time that the airplane suddenly left the ground. My engineer was calling out our good body attitude, and airspeed was increasing, and at that point we had a normal climb out, except very bumpy and rocky. As we were about 9,500 feet, my engineer called out that he was having problems to pressurize the aircraft. So then I advised the co-pilot, tell ATC that we cannot pressurize the aircraft. We'd like to return to Denver, and that we would be not requiring any assistance because it was just a pressurization problem. We then went ahead and had a normal approach and landing in Denver, and then taxied into the gate, shut the aircraft down, and went through the shutdown procedure. At about that time, I noticed quite a few of the ramp people coming out and scurrying over to look at the towards the back of the aircraft. My co-pilot asked, would it be okay if he went back there to see what everybody was going back to look at? And I said, yeah, go ahead. And I said, I'll help the engineer write up the problem with the pressurization. But shortly after that, my co-pilot came back and he said, I think we found the pressurization problem. And I said, oh, how come so fast? He says, well, it seems we got a piece of red and white antenna sticking in the belly of the airplane.
The antenna referred to by Captain Gore was located nearly 1,200 feet beyond the end of the runway and was broken off only 13 feet above the ground, dramatic proof of the potentially devastating consequences of a microburst encounter. Like Captain Gore's experience, many times the warning signs may not be absolute, so be alert to the sum total of all indicators. On takeoff or landing, if you do suspect wind shear, consider your runway selection or a short delay until conditions are more favorable. If you do make a go decision, either to take off or land, consider the options available to increase the performance of your airplane, such as your flap setting and your speed margin. If you do find yourself in a severe low-altitude wind shear during takeoff or landing, anticipate increased performance as you enter the headwind portion of the shear, followed by suddenly decreasing performance as you transition into the downdraft and tailwind segments of the shear. In this situation, you must respond quickly and correctly to avoid an accident. Increased thrust may be required all the way to full forward throttles, and trading speed for altitude by increasing your pitch attitude as necessary up to stick shaker speed may allow you to maintain or establish a positive flight path. Now, let's sum things up. The relative rarity of severe low-level wind shear encounters may in effect increase their potential as a hazard. Be prepared when you're operating in areas where the potential for wind shear exists. Be alert not only to low-level wind shear alerts from ATC, but also to PIREPs from other flights. And remember, you are an important part of this information process. If you suspect wind shear, report it. Although your encounter may have been minor, the changing nature of the phenomenon could make that encounter critical for a subsequent flight. Review your operating procedures on a regular basis and know the performance limits of your aircraft. So if you find yourself in an emergency situation, you can respond promptly and correctly. Remember, there have been documented cases of wind shear which no aircraft has the capability to successfully traverse.